Mr. Edit Man presents, what's the most badass thing one of your parents has ever done? My brother got into a fight in elementary school in the name of self-defense. My mother had to meet with the principal in order to discuss my brother's actions. The principal insisted that, even though my brother did not throw the first punch, albeit, my brother was trying to avoid the kid entirely, and the playground monitor did not do malarkey to prevent anything, he should have sat there and taken it from the kid in order to curtail any escalating violence, because it would have been the right thing to do. My mother then stood up from her seat menacingly and said something along the lines of, "So you mean to tell me that if I walk around this desk right now and start beating the malarkey out of you, that you're just gonna sit there and take it because it's the right thing to do?" He called security and we had to move my brother to a different school. My dad always told me, "Son, do not ever start a fight. But if you get in one you better beat the malarkey out of that kid because you'll be suspended anyways. And if that happens I would not be mad. And I'll take a day off and we can go see a baseball game." One summer there was a dog on the corner. He was a pit mastiff mix. As a puppy he was cute and nice. But like most mean dogs his owner was a drunk douche who happened to name his dog Whiskey. As Whiskey got older the owner treated him more and more like malarkey. The once nice and cute puppy became a vicious animal. It did not help that the drunk would forget to shut his gate at times. On the days the gate was open Whiskey would roam the corner chasing and biting anyone who would come by, only to be hit and beat by his owner after he was wrangled back in the yard by Mr. Jack Daniels himself. One day though the attacks got worse than usual. The owner was nowhere to be found. When Whiskey got out, a kid on rollerblades and walker barely escaped the grasp of the dog. Then a girl on her bike came by. She was not as lucky to get away. Whiskey had her by the ankle and pulled her off the bike. At this time though my dad just got home from work. Without hesitation he dropped his work gear and ran towards the dog and girl, pulling the dog off of her. As she got on her bike a road to safety a battle began between my dad and the dog. I looked from my porch as my dad slammed the dog into the ground, only for it to get up and latch onto his arm. Back to the pavement he went still holding onto his arm. The bites and slams continued for what seemed like an hour, but only 5 minutes until the police finally showed up. Once there my dad was able to pry the jaws away from him and get away. The dog then turned on the cops getting one by the ankle, after being shot 6 times in the chest. The scene finally ending with a bullet to the head. A week later my dad received some award from the city for saving the girl. To sum it up dad saves girl from bat malarkey dog. Cops shoot dog. My dad taught himself intermediate algebra and how to read and speak English. Also works 14 hours a day. Edit. He lived in Mexico until his late teen years and only spoke Spanish. He had 10 other brothers and sisters and lived in a poor village. He only went up to 6th grade due to lack of money. He came to the US when he was around 20. He bought English and math workbooks at the thrift store and went from there. As a trucker. We were walking in town. It was a really stormy evening. Rain, lightning, all that stuff. As we passed the church in the center of town. Important note. It's about 200 years old. Stone. And the top of the steeple ends in 4 stone spikes. One of the old spikes on top of the church fell off directly towards us. This thing was about 4 feet long and 150 pounds. It would have killed us instantly. Hot fuzz style. My dad was the only one that saw it and shoved my sister, brother and mom, and then pulled me and my other brother back with him. The spike landed in a patch of grass with a thud where my sister had been walking. None of us had seen it until it hit the ground and we were in shock the whole way home. My dad did not say much that day. I think he was as scared as we were. But nevertheless, he was ducking badass. 3 things. 2 involving my dad and 1 my mom. My dad joined the Merchant Marines right out of high school. On the way over to Vietnam, there was one guy on the ship who was just a complete asshole. He would always push the smaller guys around, shove people against walls, and just generally be a prick. One day during dinner my dad, who is about 59, but a former wrestler, saw the big asshole guy grab one of the little guys out of a nearby chair and throw him to the ground. My dad calmly stood up, grabbed the stool he was sitting on, and smashed it over the big guy's back. The big guy, now completely dazed and sprawled out on the ground, watches my dad step over him, offer a hand, and say that's the last time we'll have problems, right? The guy did not duck with people for the rest of the trip. Next up is my mom. She was big flower child living in DC during the 60s and her dad, my granddad, was really high up at the Pentagon. She would routinely go to protests where my granddad would have to step over her just to get inside his building and go to work. One day he decided to try and show her what his job was like, probably to try and minimize grief at home. by giving her a private tour of the Pentagon. He took her to one hallway in particular that he thought she would react to positively, the Hall of Heroes, or something along those lines. Basically it was a long hallway with names and pictures of fallen officers hung about half the length of the hall. My granddad thought she would be impressed by all the ways the armed forces respect their fellow soldiers. My mom looked, thought about it, and said, if only half the hallway is full, does not that mean you're never expecting peace? 6 months later the hallway was redesigned to be fully commemorative, with no empty space. Finally, one more about my dad. He had been back from the Merchant Marines for a couple years and was going with a few friends to watch a college football game. My dad is white, and he was going to the game with a black friend, a white friend, and a Hispanic friend. That did not sit well with a big group of guys sitting in a park outside the entrance to the stadium. About 12 of them walk over, clearly looking for a fight, and start hassling my dad and his friends. In most situations, a couple guys might not be that big a deal. My dad was a state champion wrestler and won a good amount of amateur boxing matches while at sea. Still, this was 12 on 4, and my dad is by nature a peace-oriented guy. No amount of talking could calm these guys though, and out of nowhere one of them pulls a knife and sinks it into the back shoulder of one of my dad's friends. After that, the place ducking erupts. People are throwing punches, dodging knives. Malarkey is just generally crazy. My dad looks over and sees out of the corner of his eye that the friend who got stabbed had tripped and was crawling backwards away from the guy with the knife, who was progressing rapidly and clearly looking to finish the job. Fortunately, this was all happening only a few feet away from him. At that moment, my dad kicks one guy off of him, pivots 90 degrees to his right, and ducking rocks the knifed guy with a left hook to the side of his face. The guy crumbles, and my dad drags his friend to a tree where he and the other friends circle up and hold Malarkey down for another 10 seconds or so while the police arrive. To sum it up, my dad is Superman, and my mom changed the Pentagon. My dad is a surgeon and I remember him coming home shaken and in a strange mood. I do not recall all the details, but I know that he was in the operating room and a clamp that was sealing a major artery slipped off. At the rate of blood loss, the patient had only a few seconds to live. My dad dropped his tools, plunged his right hand into the lake of splattering blood and guts, and grabbed the first thing he could get a grip on, which happened to be the artery. He was able to squeeze it hard enough and for long enough that another surgeon was able to reapply the clamp, saving the patient's life. He spent the evening cleaning flecks of blood off of his shoes. My dad was a social worker for the City of New York's Administration on Children's Services in the 70s and 80s. Imagine if an Indian guy, 5'4", traveling regularly to East New York or the South Bronx, entering projects and filthy homes, trying to look out for the welfare of children that generally did not have much hope. He came home mugged a few times but kept going. Edit. Wanted to add that he got paid crap, too. I would have too in my opinion. My mom was in a band that was semi-popular in our area and the province over. My dad's story is much cooler though. He worked in a small store when I was growing up and he would deal with a lot of crap from people. So one day there was a guy in the park across the street shooting a gun just willy-nilly, being a gangster. The whole time this was happening my dad is just looking out the window and calling the police so that this guy gets taken away, since it's pretty illegal to be waving a gun around and shooting it. So as soon as he hangs up, the guy decides it's a good time to hit up the store. So he walks in, gun pointed at my dad, saying empty the cash and give me the money. Calmly my dad looks at the guy and says no, that he would not hand him the money. Obviously the guy starts waving his gun more and acting like hell, shoot him, etc. But my dad continues to insist that he won't give up the cash. In fact he starts walking around the counter and egging the guy on. Shoot me, I dare you. As a side note, just read that in an Egyptian accent. It'll make it more authentic. The guy freaks out and bolts outside, running down the street. Still no cops. My dad was giving chase the whole time and catching the guy until finally he tackles him and keeps him down until the cops show up. He comes home that night with a great story and my mom freaks out at him because he could have been killed. My dad looks back at her calmly and says, "There's really no way he could have shot me. The gun had no bullets left." I counted how many times he shot the gun outside. To sum it up, my mom was a semi-known musician and my dad calmly took on an armed man without using a weapon. I was listening to the answering machine after coming home from school, 7th or 8th grade, and there was a message on it from some man who said he just got out of prison and wanted to take my dad out to dinner. This was greatly confusing for me. Apparently, my dad had been buying food for the guy's family for like a year, as his incarceration left them destitute. That's all I know about it. I do not know who he was, how my dad knew him, or why he felt he should buy them food. It was probably 10 years ago now. Reminds me that I need to ask him about it. Here's a couple. When my dad was in his early 20s, he was walking down the street in Manhattan when he noticed two men struggling inside a building. Upon closer inspection, one of the men turned out to be none other than my grandfather, his father. He tried to open the door, but it was locked, so instead he punched through it, since it was glass. He then proceeded to kick the malarkey out of the guy attacking my grandfather. It turned out to be some freak occurrence. The guy was a mugger who followed my grandpa into the building. The man actually got very lucky, since my grandfather was a bit of a badass himself, being a part of the Waterfront Commission, actively investigating the mafia, and usually carried a pistol. This day he had forgotten it. Many years later, my dad is arresting cocaine smugglers. It's the truck with two guys, and it's just my dad and one other guy doing the arresting. They each have one on either side of the truck and are questioning them separately when a crate randomly falls off the back of the truck and bursts when it hits the ground, making a sound like a gunshot. The smuggler is freaked out and asks what just happened. My dad tells him, "Your buddy just bit the dust." Then he unholsters his gun and says, "It'll give you a 10-second head start. Get up and run." The smuggler breaks down crying and begging until a moment later his buddy walks around the truck and starts dying with laughter, kinda ducked up. My dad was sleeping under the stars when a bear started pawing at his sleeping bag. Not knowing what else to do, he grabbed his pocket knife and threw his arms up out of the sleeping bag and yelled really loudly. As he was throwing his arms up, he cut his hand, making his yell that much more genuine. This scared the bear and it took off, leaving him to deal with his hand. My dad has some phenomenally badass stories. Has a gigantic sarong wearing, Holly driving man who travels the world, goes to raves, and has a foot-long grey beard. He also used to be the vice principal of my primary school. Go figure. Has had a gangrenous leg that almost got amputated 5 or so times, multiple motorbike crashes, and is one of the best people I know. Anyway, one of my favorite stories is from when he was a buffalo hunter. Yeah, even that sounds badass. I know. He had an old Toyota Ute that he took the roof and doors off. Him and the crew had to drive as fast as they could through the North Australian bush herding these buffalo. Somehow during one of the chases a stick flipped up and stabbed him in the leg, going all the way through the flesh and out the other side. He took himself off to the nearest clinic, staffed by one nurse, who managed to get the stick out without much trouble. She told him to hold a bit of gauze or something on it to stop the bleeding, and kept telling him off for leaking everywhere. He said yes, because it's coming out the other side. The nurse fainted, and Dad just got some bandages, cleaned himself up, and went on his merry way. You have made it until the end of this video. Now listen here, and listen here closely. Like and subscribe for more curated content from Mr. Edit Man. Thanks for watching.